Welcome, everybody. Today's lecture is on the biology of the superorganism. Well, let's start with this lecture by defining what a superorganism is and why honeybees are considered a superorganism when we talk about them at the colony level. A superorganism is essentially a social colony of individuals, in this case, insects, who, through a division of labor and communication, self organization, essentially form this highly connected community that functions as if it were a single organism. And honeybees are a prime example of a superorganism because it's not the individual who we really look at as kind of the organism that we manage as beekeepers. We are managing a colony. And we are managing the superorganism level. So we spend a lot of time talking about the individual, and it is important to understand things like life cycles and being able to determine who is who in a colony. But when it comes down to management, it's all happening at the superorganism level, at the colony level. And so what this lecture today is going to do is basically expose you to a little bit about the superorganism and how we should be thinking about the superorganism when we are managing honeybees. All right, so let's start by talking a little bit about what this superorganism should kind of be considered. So when we think about a colony of bees, I want you to change the way you think about bees. Don't think about them as 60,000 individuals in a box. Instead, when we look at the colony as in its totality as a superorganism, what we're talking about is something more akin to a 20 to 30 pound animal. And so each one of your colonies, like you see pictured on the left here, is essentially the same as this 20 to 30 pound dog that you see on the right. This is one of our dogs, Doobie, dressed up as a bee for your viewing pleasure. But essentially, Doobie is equivalent in weight to that colony. Now, that may seem a little strange to you, saying, okay, well, consider this a 25-pound animal, but they're functioning as a single unit. Every bee in that colony, whether it's a drone, a worker, the queen, all of them have their responsibilities, all of them have their duties, and all of them function together for the betterment of the colony, the proliferation of the superorganism. And so it is essentially a 20 to 30 pound animal that you're working with. This also should kind of change your mindset on management because when you think about it, if you were to lose one of these colonies, it's not just losing a box of bees. And for me, when I lose a colony, it's an emotional experience because I look at each one of my colonies as like an individual animal. And losing one of my colonies, and you get to know your colonies really well over the years, but losing one of my colonies it's devastating. And it's because I think about my colonies at the superorganism level. I'm not just dumping out a bunch of dead bees as individuals. I lost an entire animal at that point. And so sometimes when we shift our mindset about how we look at honeybees, it oftentimes will change how we actually manage them. And so understanding that you're managing at the superorganism level and you're managing a 25-pound animal is a really important thing to understand as you move forward in your beekeeping endeavor. So when we talk about the fact that we're managing a superorganism, what do we mean by we're managing this organism? Well, just like all livestock, you are a farmer, a livestock farmer as a beekeeper. And just like all other farmers, you have responsibilities to your animal, and in this case, to that superorganism. Your responsibilities are to provide food, provide clean, healthy food for these individuals. Now, you may think to yourself, Dr. Adam, yeah, the bees go collect their own food from trees and plants and things like that. Well, yes, they do, but what about when there's nothing flowering? Some of you may be living, in areas like Southern California, where you're in a Mediterranean climate where you pretty much have floral availability year round. I mean, there's some, periods within December and January where there might be not a lot of stuff flowering. In that case, yeah, there's a lot of food available in the landscape. But for those of us who don't live in temperate climates where there's no winter, there is a huge time of the season where food is not available in the landscape. And in that case, we either have to have them feed on the food that they gathered over the course of the season, or we have to supplement that food to ensure that our livestock does not starve during winter. For example, I live in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. We have a solid 6 months of winter, which means that my bees do not forage for those whole 6 months. And even during the season, oftentimes we'll have weather events where bees aren't flying. So you have to think about it that when in those periods of time where food is not available, it is our job as a farmer to make sure that our livestock do not starve. And that's a major problem that we see in northern climates is that either bees are not left with enough food, they don't produce enough food over the season, and then they just don't have enough food to make it through the winter, and they'll starve in the winter. When we see starvation in the winter, that is not the bee's fault. That is your fault as a beekeeper and not providing food for your animals when they need it. So you have a huge responsibility, like I said, just like every other livestock farmer. Water. Bees need water, and you have to provide water for them if they don't have a clean water source around them. And you want to provide clean water for your bees, just like all of the rest of your livestock. Clean water is a kind of the cornerstone of life for most earth-based organisms, right? So we have to provide that for them. Shelter. Bees will find shelter in the wild, but we know from research that in the current era, wild bees, bees that are feral, I won't say wild bees because, again, honeybees are not native to North America, but bees that are feral, that are not being managed, only have a 20% survival rate. So the bees actually rely on us for a lot, and shelter is one of the things that they rely on us for. We provide a beehive for our bees. That is their shelter that they stay in, and we also work with that shelter over the course of the season, depending on where you're at, with different seasons. So in winter, we may augment some of that shelter a little bit by providing some insulation to help with retaining heat during the winter, but shelter is something that we provide for them. We also have to manage their health. And this is something that we're going to spend a tremendous amount of time on all season long, is talking about maintaining colony health. That involves not only being able to diagnose problems when you see them, it also means that you have to be able to identify pests. You have to be able to understand what the levels are acceptable of pest pressure. You also have to understand all of the viruses that go along with pests and how they're transferred. All of this builds into colony health. And it is your job as a beekeeper to maintain the health of that colony at the superorganism level. So with all of this, we're managing at the colony level. So you as a beekeeper, again, when we are managing honeybees, we are managing at the colony level. Again, it's important to understand those differences between the different castes of bees, their life cycles, how long each stage of development is, because you're going to use that to make decisions management-wise in the apiary. But we're always managing at the colony level, at that superorganism level. So let's talk about what comprises this colony, right? What is a colony of bees comprised of? Well, each one of your colonies, each one of your beehives that you see pictured here on the right, each one of them contains a queen, it contains workers, it contains drones, and those appear seasonally, so you don't have drones year-round. Depending on where you're at, the seasonality of drones is going to be longer or shorter. If you're in northern climates like I am, drones are really only around for a few months during the summer, during the mating period, and then by fall, they're getting kicked out of the hive because they don't overwinter with the rest of the bees. So drones, depending on where you're at, they may be present longer or shorter periods of time, but they're not present all the time. They're only present when they're needed for mating. You're also going to have brood, and brood is comprised of eggs, larvae, and pupae. And then you're going to have food as well, and that's going to be food in the form of pollen or in the form of honey, meaning nectar that's being cured down into honey. So those are the things that make up an individual colony. So you have all of these things that make up that one colony. Now, as far as the organization of the colony and how it's structured as a superorganism, you essentially have two main parts of a superorganism, of a colony. You have the brood chamber, where all the business is happening. Bees are being raised, food's being stored, queen's present in that area. Most of your nurse bees are all in that area. And then you have your crop, which is essentially your honey, right? Your bees are producing a crop, which we harvest, which is honey. And you can see in this picture that essentially when you think about this, and let me get my cursor here, you can think about that the bottom area of your beehive is always going to be the brood chamber. And then what is stored up top is the excess honey. And now when we look at this brood section individually, what it typically is made up of And this is a little flexible, just like all biological organisms. None of these rules are hard and fast. There's a little flexibility to all of this. But essentially, a brood chamber of a fully functioning colony, when it's maxed out in size, is usually going to comprise about 2 deeps worth of space. So 9 and 5/8 inch is how deep each deep box is. So two of those is going to accommodate essentially your entire brood. That's going to be also, if you're using mediums instead of deeps, it's going to be about 3 mediums, as about the equivalent of 2 deeps of space. The bees don't care if you're using mediums or deeps. They don't. It's the same, it's just space. And so, whether you're using deeps in your operation or mediums, that's just the difference between the two. 3 deeps or 3 mediums makes up 2 deeps worth of space. But that's essentially going to be your brood chamber. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, I have to keep my queen sequestered down there because I don't want her to be wandering up in my honey supers and laying eggs where I'm going to be harvesting honey from. Keep in mind, some folks use queen excluders, and that would be basically right in between those 2 boxes where you have your brood and your honey intersecting. That's where you would put that queen excluder. You don't have to use queen excluders. I don't use any queen excluders on my entire operation. And the reason is because most of the time, and there's always exceptions, but most of the time, your queen's not going to wander beyond that 3rd medium or 2nd deep. She may lay a little bit of brood on the bottom of the first honey super, but she's not going to go much beyond that. So you don't have to have that. But essentially, the space that's going to be comprised in that is the 2 deeps or 3 mediums. Pollen is also stored in this area. Pollen is not stored in those top honey boxes. That is not stored there. It's stored in the brood chamber, and the reason is because pollen is being fed to young bees constantly as they're being raised. So it has to be close by. They do not put it up in the honey supers, so you don't have to worry about pollen being deposited up there. Now, when we talk about the honey boxes up here at top, these 2 boxes you see labeled there, that is where excess honey is stored. But honey is also stored in the brood chamber around the brood. So you'll have pollen present in the brood chamber, but you'll also have some honey present. The stuff that's above the brood chamber, that's where they're storing their excess honey. And that would be where we harvest honey from. We do not harvest honey from the brood chamber. No matter where it's at in there, you're always harvesting from those top boxes. And the reason is because most of the time, and I'll show you in this next photo here, most of the time, the honey is integrated into pollen frames. And you'll have outside frames that are pure honey as well in these brood chambers. But for the most part, the honey is integrated into the brood frames. So let's take a look at this. So now what I'm showing you here is a brood frame on the bottom that would be located in these bottom boxes. What you see here is what makes up a full brood frame. And this is kind of your classic brood frame that you see here on the bottom. This is a close-up of a similar brood frame. But what you see in this brood frame are 3 elements I want you to note that make up this chamber. We have brood, which is pictured right here. That is all capped. We have a pollen band right next to the brood, and then honey on the outside. This is the classic way that bees store resources and young in the brood chamber. The middle is always going to be brood, followed by a ring of pollen on the outside, and then honey outside of that. Now, even on this bottom picture here, you can see this happening. So this is all our brood in the middle. If you look really closely, you can see pollen on these outside areas right here, and then this upper area right here. If you look really closely, you can see a little shininess in there. That's honey being stored. So that's a classic brood frame, and that's what you would expect to find in your brood chamber is frames that look like this. Now, when we look at our honey supers, those top boxes, what you're going to see in there are frames that look like this. And this is a full honey frame. So there's no larva on here. There might be a little tiny bit of pollen stored down in here below. Not a big deal. But essentially, this is a full honey frame, and that's what's being stored up in these top boxes. This is the crop. This is what you're going to harvest, is what's in these top boxes of these beehives, of these individual colonies. You're not going to be harvesting brood frames to get honey off of them. You're only going to be harvesting full honey frames when you harvest, and we'll go over all of that at a much later lecture when we start talking about honey harvesting. All right, let's talk about the rules of the superorganism. So The queen rules the hive, pretty much. And the way that she does that is through queen pheromone. It's not that she's necessarily going around and putting bees in their place, but she produces a set of pheromones that really keep the colony in check. So I'm going to give you three different examples of the role and the importance of these pheromones in a superorganism. So let's start first with keeping the colony in check. We call this queen right. What we mean when we say that we're queen right is we mean that we have a queen that is laying and present. So a healthy queen that's producing a good amount of bees. That's what we mean by queen right. So we're going to talk about that a little bit in depth. And then we're going to also talk about reproduction as far as swarming. So swarming is a natural reproductive process that happens where the queen her pheromones play a role in the colony actually making that move to become swarmy and actually swarming. The next one we're going to talk about is when we have no queen present. So that means there's no pheromone present. And we'll talk about that in the context of a laying worker. So let's jump into these three examples of how queen pheromone really rules the superorganism. So let's talk about being queen right. This is a term that you're going to hear a lot in this course and throughout your beekeeping career. And essentially what it means is that we have a fully functioning, healthy colony that has a queen present, that's laying, we have brood and eggs present. So it means that we are queen right. Now, being sure that you're queen right is something that you're going to have to work on as a beekeeper. This is one of the most critical things for you to be able to see during an inspection is being able to determine if you're queen right. The only way you can do this, there's two ways you can do this. You either have to see the queen, which to be quite honest, is not going to be the case most of the time. And this is why the second way is the most important thing that you need to train yourself up on as you're getting ready for inspections, is the ability to see eggs in a colony. This is something that is very difficult for folks, but what we say, the reason that we want to be able to see eggs is because, like I said, during the middle of the season, when you have 60,000 bees in that colony, finding the one queen in that colony, it's going to take too much time, and you don't want to be in a colony for a long period of time when you're doing inspections. Our inspection should last about 20 minutes. And so spending an hour trying to find the needle in the haystack in a bee colony is not a good way to do inspections. So the way that we typically are able to determine that we have a queen present and that she's laying is we find eggs. And if you remember back to your life cycles that we talked about in our biology of the individual lecture, egg stage is 3 days. And so we know that if we have eggs present, that our queen was there within the last 3 days, and we can safely say by knowing that our queen is present and that we are queen right. So it's really important to be able to see this. Now, I'm going to just take a moment to kind of talk about this. So this bottom right picture here is a picture of eggs. This is what you need to be able to see when you are inspecting a colony. These are small. And so if you wear glasses like I do, you may need to have, your readers on or something like that in order to be able to see these small eggs. But there is a trick to this, especially for new beekeepers, and I want you to think about this as you're purchasing equipment. You see that this particular picture, that the background is black. Now, if you remember back to your equipment lecture, there are different types of foundation. Foundation that's plastic comes in different colors. You can get it in white, yellow, black. Black foundation is typically a really good choice for new beekeepers to have in their brood chamber. Why? Because those white eggs pop on that black. Those white eggs are difficult to see on yellow or white foundation. Typically, yellow and white foundation is used for honey supers. Black foundation is a very nice thing to have for new beekeepers who are trying to see eggs because they pop on there. Now, you also are probably going to need a flashlight as well. And I carry a flashlight with me in the apiary just in case on those days where it's kind of tough to see, I can put a light down in there and look at those eggs. But you have to be able to see this in order to be able to determine your queen right. This is part of that whole colony inspection, right? Inspecting the superorganism, you're going to have to determine if you're queen right. And this queen right status, her pheromones, her laying, brood being present, all of those things all are the major factors that are keeping other bees from laying. Let's talk about that for just a moment. So, queens are not the only bees that can lay. All workers have the ability to lay eggs. However, workers only lay unfertilized eggs because they're not mated. And so, it's important to understand that what's keeping those workers from being able to lay unfertilized eggs is queen pheromone. Queen pheromone is keeping them in check. So this big fat queen right here that you see, this she is a beauty. Her pheromones are what are keeping the ovaries of all those other workers in check, and they're keeping them suppressed. When we have a queenless situation where there's no queen present, those pheromones are not keeping those in check, and all of a sudden your workers will start laying, and we call that a laying worker situation, we're going to talk about in just a couple slides. All right, so let's talk about the swarming at the colony level and where pheromone kind of plays into that as the queen is ruling the hive. Swarming is a totally natural thing. And I think for a lot of new beekeepers, sometimes they think of swarming as a negative thing. Now, swarming is a negative thing in the sense of swarming, you lose half of your bees, and we don't want to do that as beekeepers. But swarming is a very natural process. But swarming happens for two different reasons. First, swarming happens, like I said, as part of the natural reproductive process. So the organism, over time, as it's evolved this ability to naturally reproduce at the superorganism level. Why? Because the superorganism is the organism really that keeps honeybees going. A single bee will not survive by itself in the landscape. It has to rely on that entire superorganism. So the natural process that we see in the spring for bees is that they naturally want to swarm so that they can replace winter losses. This is part of their natural evolutionary history as an organism, is that they replace losses at the colony level through swarming in the spring. Totally natural process. We play a role in that, though, as beekeepers. So I don't want you just to think that we just let this happen every spring. No, we play a role so that we can take advantage of this impulse. We do that by creating splits or nukes, and we'll talk about that later. Colony level congestion is the second situation in which swarming happens at that superorganism level. However, this is due to poor management by the beekeeper. This is not the natural reproductive swarm. Now, natural reproductive swarms happen in the spring. They only happen in the spring. All the rest of the season, if you're having swarming issues, it's because of space management. You are not giving your bees enough space. They're building too quickly. They're getting congested. And what happens during this situation of a congestion-related swarm is that you have all these resources coming in. So typically this happens when you're in high pollen flows or high honey flows. This is when swarming due to congestion happens, which is usually pretty terrible because that's when you need the most bees, is when you're bringing on in the most resources. So by losing half of them, that is pretty upsetting as a beekeeper. But again, this is totally on you as the beekeeper. This is not the bee's fault when it comes to swarming due to congestion. What's happening is that because all of those resources are coming in, the bees are stuffing it wherever they can. The way that you stop or you prevent a congestion swarm is by adding drawn supers. Drawn supers are space that bees can use immediately. If you are a new beekeeper and you just have raw foundation, not drawn, that means that when you add that space, that is not usable space. That is work. They have to draw those frames before they can ever store anything in it. So this is a problem that we see a lot of the times with new beekeepers is congestion swarms. And a lot of times it's equipment related. You just don't have the drawn equipment yet to be able to provide them with the space they need to prevent this congestion. So what's happening, all these resources are coming in, and if there's no place to put them, the foragers aren't going to stop bringing them in. If it's available in the landscape, they're going to bring it in. What happens, though, is that the house bees that are taking those resources from the foragers and placing them in the colony, they don't have anywhere to put them, so they start putting the resources, pollen and nectar, in the brood chamber. And we call this backfilling. When this starts to happen, essentially what happens is now we have a competition for space between house bees that are placing resources and the queen who's trying to find a place to lay eggs. What happens is as the space gets taken over by those resources, there's less sites to lay, which means that brood pheromone starts to go down And because the queen is not laying or doesn't have as much space to lay, her brood pheromone will start to decline. And because of how many bees are in this tight space, because you don't have enough space, that's what's creating the congestion, that queen pheromone starts to dilute as well. And so when that happens, what the colony does as a reaction to this is they start raising a new queen in preparation for a swarm. And then if you end up going the full cycle, you end up having a situation where the old queen takes off with half the workers, and a new queen is left to basically manage this colony, the remainder of that colony. So this is another situation in which the superorganism is taking action as an organism, just like in the reproductive swarm, but it all comes back to that queen ruling the hive and the role of pheromone. Now, I will say this is a simplified version of this, and we will talk about this more in detail in the swarming lecture. There are a lot more pheromones at play here than just queen pheromone when it comes to all of these things happening in a colony. So this is a simplified version of that, but this is essentially what's happening, is that those pheromones are dictating what's going to happen at the colony level. Let's talk about laying workers. So this is when we don't have a queen present and there is no queen pheromone present. When this happens within a very short period of time, you end up getting a situation where the ovaries start to develop in your workers and they start laying eggs. Now, one of the things that is a big misconception in the beekeeping industry, and I've even heard experienced beekeepers tell me this, is that the laying worker is a single individual. That is not the case. When you are in a laying worker situation, it is multiple workers that are laying at the same time. So it's not like you can find that one laying worker and take her out and fix this problem. I've also had people tell me, oh, well, I dump all of my bees out when I have a laying worker situation and I find the fat ones and those are the ones that are laying eggs. No, that's not the case either. This situation right here is also known as a hopelessly queenless colony. And there's a reason that we call it that, because there's no way to fix this. Once your workers start laying, once they have gone that far and they have started laying eggs in the colony, there's no way to fix this. The only way to fix a laying worker colony, period, is to combine it with a queen-right colony. That's it. You can throw as much money and time at this as you want. You can add as many mated queens to this as you want. They're going to kill every single one of them. And the reason is because you've had a situation where queen pheromone is absent for so long that those ovaries have developed and the workers have started laying. They're not going to accept anything you throw at them. The only thing that they will accept is being combined with a queen-right colony, which will then provide enough brood pheromone, queen pheromone, and enough workforce to defend the queen-right colony to ensure that these colonies can assimilate with one another without any big problems. Now, how do you determine if you have a laying worker situation? Well, it's pretty darn simple, and you can see it right in this picture. A queen-right colony is always going to have a single egg in the bottom of the cell. Look at these cells here. And this is why it's so important for you to be able to tell what's going on in these cells when you're doing inspections. Every single one of these cells, these are gobs and gobs of eggs. And you notice that not all of them are at the bottom of the cell. Some of them are on the side walls. They're basically laying these eggs anywhere. They aren't as skilled at placement as the queen is. Their abdomens are shorter, so they sometimes can't reach the bottom of the cell, which is why you see them on the side wall sometimes. But if you see multiple eggs, and it doesn't have to be like this. This is an extreme situation pictured here. But if you see 2 or 3 or 4 eggs in a cell, that is an indication that your queen is gone. That is an indication that your queen is gone. And so you have to be able to see this and be able to react to this. These colonies that are laying workers, they decline very quickly. This is a death sentence to a colony if you do nothing to it. This is how you kill a superorganism, by not being able to tell if you're queen right, is by getting into a laying worker situation and doing nothing about it. Now, you see all these eggs, and these eggs will hatch, but what will hatch from them is drones. Because these are unmated bees. They can only lay drones. They're not mated, so they can't lay female bees. And what you can think about this, why would bees be doing this? Why would they be spending all this time laying all these eggs and raising drones when drones mean nothing to a colony as far as support system? They're basically a suck on resources and are basically just a genetic transfer device. Well, that's what you should be thinking about them as. This is the last ditch effort of this colony to get its genetics out into the world. And the way that they're doing that is by raising drones. Most of the times, these are going to be small drones in comparison to our normal drones because you can see that these are not drone cells. These are worker cells that they're laying these drones in. And so they'll end up being smaller drones overall. But this is a very devastating condition, and we'll talk about this more in a later lecture with swarms and laying workers and how we work with these, how we prevent these, how we like I said, there's only one way to fix them. That's combining it with the queen right colony. But again, this is a situation that shows how important the queen is and how important these pheromone roles are into managing the superorganism at large. All right, let's also talk about the division of labor. So the division of labor within honeybee colonies, we talked about this in the individual lecture, and that's really where we talk about like the division of labor as an organism is like what are these individual bees doing as they age. But again, division of labor is also related to pheromones. And what I want you to think about is that pheromones, and I've been talking about them now, for several slides, but pheromones, when you're thinking about pheromones, what pheromones are, I shouldn't say what I mean by that, is what they are volatile chemicals, meaning that they're chemicals that volatilize into the air, and the odor that they carry is actually interpreted by bees and other insects at large. Insects and plants overall, this is how they communicate, is through volatile chemicals. You have pheromones, cinnamones, chiromones, all these different types of volatile chemicals that play all of these different roles in the landscape when it comes to plants and insects. But essentially, plants and insects are talking to each other through these pheromones, through these volatile chemicals. And that is the language of the bees. And basically, these pheromones will impact the role of workers, and we've talked about how workers will change roles over time. Well, roles of workers can also, they can change over time. And like we said in the biology lecture, we start with, basically the first role of a bee after it hatches, and you can see that in this picture is that they're house cleaning bees. They're cleaning up their own cells, and then they're becoming nurse bees. They're taking care of all of the young. They start producing wax. They're wax builders, and then they turn into guard bees, and then finally the last role that we have for our bees is as a forager. Right? That's their last role before they die, is a forager. Now, I say this and I talk about this division of labor over time because that division of labor can change also, and it can change based off the needs of the bees. So, for example, a hive can shift the roles and responsibilities of workers based on pheromones is one of the signals that they can base these needs off of. So let me use an example. So nurse bees will age over time and become foragers, but foragers can actually revert back to nurse bees under certain situations. And the situation would be essentially you had a large die-off of nurse bees for some reason. And the foragers that are part of that colony, some of them will actually revert back to a nurse bee in order to do that. Now, that's a pretty amazing thing to think about. It's not just as easy as just saying, okay, I'm not going out today, I'm going to help out in the nursery. No, there are actual biological changes that happen with those bees as they're undergoing that change. And an example would be in the hyperpharyngeal gland. Hyperpharyngeal gland in nurse bees is an important, or serves as an important component in the development of royal jelly and feeding that royal jelly to the young. However, as they age over time, the hyperpharyngeal gland changes its role and actually starts to produce enzymes, which are important in breaking down nectar so that it can be stored as honey and converted into honey. So there are physical changes that happen along with this as well, but over the course of time and the needs of the colony, based on how these pheromone levels end up interacting, and I'm not just talking about queen pheromone overall, I'm talking about multiple pheromones, but these can have a huge impact on the colony at large and the roles of individuals even with their division of labor. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up the superorganism lecture by Well, really trying to illustrate that all beekeeping is local. So you're going to have these colonies, and we're going to be going through this course together all year. And basically, what I want you to remember as we're talking through all of this material all year long is that it is very important for you to understand that all beekeeping is local. So you are best suited by contacting a local bee club and getting in contact with them and starting to work with them so that you can start to understand what are the local things in your area that are important to know. And I'm going to show you two different slides here to illustrate how much beekeeping is local, right? So a little bit of background. I'm originally from Southern California. That's where I started beekeeping. Beekeeping in California is very different than beekeeping in Michigan, where I live now. And the reason why it's so different is because of the climate. It's pretty easy, right? So this graph that I'm showing you here, there's three bars in this graph. You see that you have colony population on the y-axis. The x-axis is basically time. The blue line is a package colony, the green line is an overwintered colony, and the red line is a requeened colony in June. Really, what I want you to focus on is the red and blue lines. And all I'm trying to illustrate by showing you this graph, this is colony buildup in Manitoba, Canada. So this is more reflective of my climate than it would be for someone in lower latitudes, like say in the south or out west. But what I want you to see in this is that essentially our beekeeping season in these climates, in northern climates, really lasts from about May to November. That's our season. That is the whole time that we're working bees. And everything happens within that essentially 6-month period. That is very different than if you live in Texas or Arizona or California for that matter. When I lived in California, we managed bees pretty much year round. There was literally about 3 weeks in December and 2 weeks in January where we'd have a little dearth, and sometimes we wouldn't even have a dearth. Sometimes it would all be based on eucalyptus, because eucalyptus is usually the first thing that starts flowering in the beginning of the year, where I'm from in California. And so as soon as eucalyptus started flowering, and usually that was in January, we were back off to the races. There was never this long period of time where we were not working bees and we were focused. We were basically reliant on all of our good management for 6 months to ensure that they lived these 6 months where we're not really managing them too much. That's what I mean by all beekeeping is local. It is imperative that you get a local connection to support you. Heroes to Hives is going to give you a very broad education that's going to set you up for success, but you have to relate this back to what's happening at your local level. Let's take this a step further to illustrate how important it is for you to understand how to manage your superorganism, your colony, at the local level. This is a graph that I've put together over several years for many different beekeeping courses that I run in northern climates specifically. And what we have here is we have the year up here at top, and then we have 4 different categories: the superorganism, forage, which means plants, you, the beekeeper, and then varroa mites, which you're going to get sick about me talking about varroa mites all year long. But essentially, let's talk about what happens over the course of the season. This is for my location, northern Michigan. We, again, 6 months of solid winter. So this is what our location looks like. Now, you can create something like this for your own location, and I highly recommend that you spend the time to do it, because it's not something you're going to do your first year. But after you get a couple years under your belt, or maybe you've been beekeeping for a couple years, you're going to start noticing that there is timing that happens very consistently with a lot of different things that you're working in. And being able to put that down on paper so that you can plan accordingly is a great way to set yourself up for success. So let's talk about this in detail. I'm going to start with the superorganism. So for us in northern climates, and this is going to be true, this graph right here is pretty much going to be true for anybody that lives above the 45th parallel in the United States. This is going to be very similar, unless you're on a coast. If you're in Washington, it might be a little bit different because a little more temperate on that Pacific coast, the Northwest coast. But essentially, when we talk about the superorganisms, right here, we have a winter cluster. So the bees are just clustered up thermoregulating. January, February, sometimes as late as April, we have bees clustered because of snow. So really, our winter lasts until about mid-March here where I'm at. We're not doing a lot of management right then. But then you see right in the middle of, say, March to beginning of April, that's when we start to see spring buildup. That's when brood starts to get put on. It's usually right around mid-March. And we may still have snow on the ground, but brood's getting put on at that point, and we're starting to see bees build at that point. Once we hit, say, mid-May, if weather's permitting, or early June, that's when we start seeing honey coming in for our colonies here in the Upper Peninsula and northern Michigan and northern climates in general. Usually for us, the honey flow is going to last somewhere between June all the way through July, sometimes into August, but very rarely for where we're at. Generally, in Michigan, we usually have a dearth during this period of usually the first couple weeks in August, end of July. That dearth period is sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't, but we put it down on there just so that we know that might be a period of time when we may actually start to need to think about starting to feed for winter bees. And what do you see also coinciding right there after our dearth is in August, we also start to see our winter bees being raised. Now, for those of you who are new to beekeeping, we're going to talk about this in a later lecture, but there are winter and summer bees if you live in cold climates. The winter bees are very different than your summer bees. They're actually biologically, they're different than your summer bees. And so winter bees are actually a very important thing to note because this is the most critical time to make sure your bees are healthy. If your varroa is out of control, when your winter bees are being raised, your colony is going to have no chance of survival for winter. And again, I'll talk about this in detail in a later lecture. But winter bees are being raised during that time. And then again, right back to cluster by mid-October for us. So very short season. Again, if you're in a more temperate climate, this is going to look very different for you. And so it's important for you to reach out to the experts in your area, whether it's a college that's available to you, maybe a land grant institution that has a beekeeping program that can kind of key you up on what's the seasonality of bees. If you're working with the Great Plains Master Beekeeping Program, our partner organization, you all can transfer credits over to once you complete our course. They have for every state that's part of GPMB has a state calendar that we actually develop for that program. So if you're in Nebraska or if you're in Minnesota or Missouri, you know, a lot of the Midwest states, there's calendars available in GPMB that illustrate a lot of this. So you can also find that from organizations. Generally experienced beekeepers are going to be your best bet on this. Usually an experienced beekeeper knows exactly what's happening all times of the year because they've done it so many years in a row, all right? Let's talk about forage now. So like, again, for us, and this could be something that you do as well, when is your forage available? Being able to identify when plants are flowering is really important because that's when your bees are going to be able to get forage. For us, here in northern Michigan and the Upper Peninsula, boy, January through April, you're not getting any forage. We may have some soft maples that are starting to come up at that point. Red maple is an example, but most of the time it's too cold for the bees to be able to take advantage of that resource. If you're in lower Michigan or in Indiana or Iowa or any of those other lower states, as we start to go lower in the latitudes, this is obviously going to change, and oftentimes bees are able to take advantage of those early season maples in those more southern latitudes. You can see that once forage comes available, the main thing that we see here is pollen availability. So in my area, again, beekeeping's local. In my area, May is usually a time when you can actually get pollen bound because there's so much pollen coming in from the conifer trees that it's just backfilling your entire colony. So this is a time when we may actually see, conditions that start to cause a little bit of congestion. And then you can see that's followed up with a honey flow. So usually mid-June to July is our swarm season up here, mainly because you've had so much pollen and so much nectar coming in for a month that if you have not managed space appropriately, you're going to be in a swarm situation. Again, you see that sometimes we have a long dearth or a short dearth, depending on the period of the season. Sometimes we don't have really any great availability in through September. So for me, sometimes my honey season usually kind of stops right around mid-August. And that's very different if you're living in a different area. All right, and then you see no forage available right at the mid September. Usually, goldenrod's the last thing, buckwheat, last things that we see in the landscape that are available, and then after that, there's nothing, and our bees have to survive for the next 6 months without any resources. For us as a beekeeper, you can see that there's all sorts of things that you should be thinking about as a beekeeper during these times as well. So, like when we're monitoring for food, what I mean is that we're making sure that our bees don't starve. So, I actually go out and I'll show you this in instructional videos later on in the course how to go out in winter and check if your bees are short on food to make sure they don't starve. So, that's something that we do during the winter is we monitor food. This is also a time when you're going to order bees and equipment during the winter, and spring, early spring is generally when you want to get this stuff ordered. Bees are very high in demand and usually probably sold out. I would say nukes, especially, are going to be sold out by April in most areas, but you can still get packages available most of the time through early May. You can see for us here, this is when packages typically arrive, is usually around the end of April, beginning of May. For us, nukes are available right after that. Nukes take a little longer to develop, so they're usually a little bit later after. We're also doing spring reversals during that time, splits. We're managing space and health during the main part of the season as a beekeeper. And then you can see once we hit mid-August, we're starting to prepare for winter already up here. Again, illustrating that this is all local. So you need to understand what's happening in your locality so that you can make educated decisions on what you're doing with your management. The last thing I'll mention here is the Varroa line. Again, we're not managing Varroa in the winter, but as soon as we start to get brood on, if we have an opportunity, we'll do an oxalic acid application and knock down any of those phoretic mites that are hanging around in that colony. There's really not a lot of management for us up here April and May. If you're somewhere else that's more southern, there's going to be a lot of activity in April and May. Most of the time in other localities, usually splits are being done anywhere from, I'd say, February all the way through May, depending on where you're at in the country. Monitoring and managing Varroa mite is happening all season long. Varroa for us peaks at the end of July, beginning of August. That's something important to note in your area, and you'll notice that over time through good record keeping. And we'll talk about record keeping in another lecture. But making sure you're taking good notes so that you can actually understand when these events are happening. When are your mites peaking? That's a good thing to know because you want to be ahead of that peak to make sure that they're managed and under control. You can also see that Varroa peaking right here, if you move up a little bit, also happens right around the same time when our winter bees are being raised, which is devastating because if those winter bees are compromised by Varroa, they have no chance of surviving the winter. And then you can see our last thing here is an OA application, oxalic application in late season. So this is an example to highly detailed illustrate that you need to ensure that you are connecting with some local beekeepers. Now, as Heroes to Hives is, we're an online program. We do provide some on-ground instruction. We do not provide mentors for you. We do not make those connections. We trust that you are able to go to a bee club, a local bee club, or a state beekeeping organization, and be able to find a mentor or just talk to folks about beekeeping. The beekeeping community is a very I'll say a very accepting and engaging community. And usually when an individual says that, they're new and they're looking for someone to kind of show them the ropes or maybe give them a little advice, you're probably going to have more beekeepers respond to that with advice than you want. But it's a great industry, and generally reaching out to especially a state beekeeping organization or your local bee club is going to be the best way to figure out all these local nuances of keeping bees in your own local area. All right, so in summary for today, balance is key when it comes to working with a superorganism and your rights or your responsibilities as a beekeeper. So as a beekeeper, our responsibility to the superorganism is to ensure that we're queen right when we're doing inspections, making sure that that queen is healthy and laying and ensuring that we are not in a situation that's going to result in a swarm or laying workers. We need to provide them with resources when they're needed, and that is not always conducive to our schedule. Your bees are going to be on their own schedule. They are not going to be on your schedule. And so when they need resources, you need to be able to jump into that. If you have such a busy life where you cannot drop something and meet the needs of your bees when they need it, it might be a good indication that you're just too busy for bees in general. Just like all livestock, they are not going to wait for your schedule. And if you put off things for a week or two with bees, things can go sideways very quickly, especially if you're in a place like I am, where we only have 6 months of a beekeeping season. You have to be on your game in those types of climates in order to ensure that you do not fall behind and get in a situation that you can't recover from. So making sure that you're providing them with resources like clean food, clean water, really important thing to ensure that you're maintaining the health of your colony over the season. You need to manage health as well. And managing health just does not mean providing food and water. It means being able to see and be able to distinguish when there's problems happening in the colony itself. And that could be everything from a disease being present to high pest populations as well. But managing health is going to be a key part of what you do, and that's all done at the superorganism level. You're going to maintain colony space, and this is going to be to help prevent swarming. So providing space when it's needed is something that we do at the colony level to ensure that we do not get into a situation where we have a swarm due to congestion of the colony. And then finally, and one of the most important things you're going to do, and boy, you're going to just get sick of me talking about varroamite and managing pests and how to monitor for them, because I'm not going to talk about it pretty much ad nauseum entire course. But you need to monitor your pests, and you need to manage them when necessary. And we'll give you the tools and show you how to do that as we get a little further on in the course. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and we'll see you at the next one.